Good afternoon, everybody. As Freddie said, my name is Kieran O'Sullivan. I'm a physiotherapist. I work in Ireland. This was my first time coming to Sweden, so it looked like quite a long distance. In case anybody wonders where Limerick is, it's the little dot on the A. We get no snow, but lots of rain. The most important point, if the Irishman speaks too fast, you have to wave your hands a lot. So nice and slow, and again, stop me if there are any major points. In terms of the background, it's very easy for people to make suggestions. So there is always a new diet that will cause people to lose lots of weight. There is always a new cure for vision, back pain, neck pain. This is an advertisement from many decades ago. It was about an electric belt, and it said, this will cure any disease on earth, and it cures when others fail. Now, clearly, if this was true, we should still be buying this belt. This sounds very impressive. The problem was, there was no evidence. There was no science, and this is no longer on sale. Similarly, there is always a new diet, promising to lose lots and lots of weight, that we will all look younger, fitter, more beautiful. But again, the evidence sometimes isn't there. Today, we're talking about posture, and specifically the backup chair. We know that over the last few years, people spend more time sitting, not just in Sweden, but throughout the Western world. And everybody agrees that sitting well would be a good idea, whatever sitting well means. In terms of progress, we spend more and more time talking to people, reading the papers, listening to music, all in front of computer screens. So we have a lot less variety in our daily life. And while everybody talks about good ergonomics, it's sometimes harder than it looks. So what do we mean? Some people suggest you should sit up straight. So this image suggests that if you put the keyboard straight up over your head, you would sit very straight. But of course, nobody wants to try this. Then we come back to recommendations. So most people would agree that this is not very good. And then lots of people suggest this is ideal. This is very good. However, when we look at the research, there is very little research to show that this is better. That this, if you sit this way, you get less pain. So one of the researchers, Dr. Wim Grooten, he did a review looking at if somebody has pain at work, how do we help them? And what he showed is that if you do individual measures, so if you tell somebody to be more flexible or more strong or to lose weight, it usually doesn't help much. And it's a little bit better if you make changes at the workplace. So rather than telling somebody to do an exercise, it's much better to change their work environment. In summary, changes at the workplace are better than individual measures, so one-off treatments of exercise or losing weight. But even at that, the evidence is still not really, really good. So a big review recently looked at all the studies when you make people sit properly, the right way. And actually it says that if you look at typical ergonomic interventions, where you typically put a person into a good office chair with armrests, back support, neck support, it doesn't help them very much. Yet we spend a lot of money prescribing very expensive chairs and furniture. And this is confusing, because everybody tells us that you must sit with 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 70, 90. And this implies that if it was 92 degrees, it would be terrible. 95 degrees, you will be in hospital. So it is confusing. But again, what you don't want is you don't want me to make suggestions. You want to hear the evidence. So good posture. We often ask people, what does good posture mean? Now, I'm going to do a study here. I'm going to ask you all, can you show me what good posture is while you're sitting there? Anybody? What would you think it would look like? Yeah, probably a little bit like that. So sitting forward, back straight. Yeah. And what about bad posture? Kind of, yeah, everybody kind of goes this kind of thing. Yeah, right, okay. So when we look at what good and bad posture means, that's your impression. I wonder what other people think. What do you think is good posture? What about if you look at it in the cinema, the restaurant, if you're in any social event, how do you know if somebody has back pain? You know, when you look at them, if they're not crying. How do they move when they have pain? Do they sit nice and relaxed? Or do they sit upright, tense and move quite a lot? Or do they sit nice and relaxed? And of course, we see when we look in the cinema or the restaurant that people in pain, they work much harder. So those of you who've never had back pain, you sit quite easily, it's quite natural. But when people have pain, they find it very hard to sit well. So people commonly suggest this kind of a posture would be good, this very straight back. So a lot of the time, when we ask people, show me how you should sit, they suggest this. But how long could you sit like this? If I asked you all now, you must sit like this for the rest of the day. What, would you do it? Okay, you couldn't do it, exactly. Why?
You have to work too much constantly.
Yeah, it's too hard, it's too much work. What would start getting very tired very quickly? All those muscles in your back. And after a while, you would like to take a break and walk. So one of the things we did, slow down, one study we did this year was looking at 300 physiotherapists in Europe. Netherlands, Ireland, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And we asked them, which of these is the best way for people to sit? I'll tell you what the physios said. What do you think they said? Which posture do you think they said was the best?
9, I think.
9, we have some suggestions, so this one. And any other takers? 2? Okay, any other takers? 8, okay. So, some interesting findings. I'll give you the results first and then we'll discuss. The 2 most common selected postures, 30% of the physiotherapists selected posture 5 and 55% selected posture 9. So 85% of the physiotherapists picked those 2. Now I'll get rid of the numbers. We then asked them why. And the people who picked 5 and 2 emphasized having a strong, straight back. And then we asked them, and would you sit like this? Oh, I couldn't. You know, it's impossible. The people who selected posture 9, the most common posture, they said, well, it looks natural. It looks a little easier than the others. So, what we can say about bad posture before we get on to good posture. Bad postures tend to be very static. So, for example, it's natural to have some movement when we're sitting. It's also very unhelpful to have lots of muscle tension. So, for example, if we ignore back pain and think of neck and shoulder pain, would you think it would be good for anybody to sit and type like this? No, because it's way too hard, much too high level of muscle tension. So what we should have for all our postures, back, neck and shoulders, is it shouldn't be static, it shouldn't have too much muscle tension, and it should not be close to end range. What I mean by end range is not too much this way, but everybody knows that. But what people sometimes forget is that this isn't very good either. So our question was, can we facilitate, can we help neutral postures? By neutral postures, I mean not really like this, not really like this, somewhere in the middle. Neutral postures, not too static, so the person can move a little bit. And that doesn't require too much tension. Because as some of you have already said, sitting in a good posture can often be very, very hard. How are we going to do this? This is a study done by another group, showing that if you change the hip angle, it reduces the tension on the back. It reduces pressure on the back. So having your hips less bent, less flexed, can reduce the pressure on the back. So that's one thing we were going to look at. they didn't look at back pain, but they did look at the effect on the back. And then lots of people have started looking at dynamic sitting. By dynamic sitting, I mean sitting where you've got some movement. So using balls or cushions where you can get some movement. But we know again that dynamic sitting on its own doesn't really seem to have a big influence on back pain. So what about combining these, where we have a better hip angle and more movement? Now, prolonged sitting for a long period of time. The average person is still sitting well in excess of 12 or 13 hours a day. We think it's a problem in back pain because of two things. The person doesn't move. If the person is staying still all day, sitting or standing or lying, any of those positions for a prolonged period is difficult. Secondly, sitting can involve high levels of muscle tension, and that can be very fatiguing. So the idea here is that we would integrate sitting with other healthy lifestyle habits. So dynamic sitting. Could we have the person being able to move a little more while sitting? Could they sit with less hip flexion? So for example, using this stool, less hip flexion and more movement. Avoiding prolonged sitting, so getting them so that they can get up and move out of the chair more. And looking at the other factors associated with back pain. So for example, inadequate physical activity, people needing to exercise. And looking at other lifestyle factors, weight, diet, stress. So for example, in the last few years, televisions get thinner. We do the opposite. So the idea here is that we look at combining mobility with saddle-type seats, where we have more movement and less hip flexion. And also we can vary that. So for example, by varying the amount of mobility in the chair, which we can discuss later, we can vary the challenge. So the first study we're going to look at here is, can we reduce the effort of sitting? So as I suggested to you earlier, lots of people, when we ask them, can you sit in a good way? They will say, oh, I can for 1 minute, and then I must relax. So what we did, we wanted to see if using this chair can reduce the work of sitting. Can it make it easier? So we stuck some electrodes on muscles to see if it was easier. Secondly, we got people, while sitting on this chair, to do some office tasks. So they went typing on a keyboard, they answered the telephone, they stapled some paperwork, they did some filing. Typical office tasks. And the first study was on people without pain, just to see what happens when you have healthy, pain-free people. As I said, nobody can really say what's definitively a good sitting posture. However, this sitting posture is most commonly selected. The lower back is a little bit like standing, where you've got a little bit of an arch or support in your back. And we just wanted to see how hard it's going to be. How can sitting on this stool make it easier? So these were the two chairs we used first. We used this one without a backrest. The backrest is removed initially because we want to make sure, first of all, what's the effect when you just change the hip angle and increase the movement. The backrest is the next study. So this is what people did. They typed, and we just compared the two chairs. This is the technical bit. I'll go through this quickly. We stuck electrodes on 3 tummy muscles, 3 back muscles. We measured how slouched they were by sticking that gadget on their back, and it tells us if they are like this or like this. And we wanted to know how sore or how uncomfortable they felt. So we used this body part discomfort. So we asked them before, in the middle, and at the end. So, first thing, when we put people into a good sitting posture, so we made them all sit in a good sitting posture, either on the backup or the other chair. So basically, spinal posture was the same on both. And what we found that sitting on this chair, it involved 21% less effort. So the people sitting on that chair said That's on average about 20% easier. The second part was when we looked at their muscle activity. In their back muscles, on average, it was between 30 and 50% less activity. In other words, to sit in a good posture on this chair was easier. It was easier to maintain it. The person didn't have to work as hard. The next was looking at the typing and office tasks. First of all, we looked at how slouched, how flexed their back was. So sitting on the back up while typing, the person had 20% less flexion. In other words, they were less like this, more like this on the back up. They also had greater range of motion. In other words, they moved more. They slouched, they moved, they had a greater range of motion. Now usually, when somebody sits in less flexion, it's harder. Usually, it requires, the person says it's too hard, it's too tiring, it requires more muscle activity. However, we didn't find that when using this chair. What we found, this is the 3 stomach muscles and this is the 3 back muscles. This just measures how hard the muscles are working. The white is the back up, the black is the other chair. What I'm pointing out is in these 2 examples, these 2 back muscles, the back muscles were able to work easier. They didn't have to work as hard on the back up, despite maintaining a better posture. In other words, this reinforces the idea that it took a little bit of the work out of sitting upright. So on average, for the back muscles, about 30 to 50% easier to sit in a good posture using this stool. That was for the typing. Then for the dynamic task, where they were reaching, stapling, filing, writing, we found the same basic idea. That on these muscles over here, particularly this one of the back muscles, they were less active on the back up. So again, for the same task, less slouching, less flexion, and also less muscle activity, less effort. So the conclusions from this. Is it easier to maintain a good posture using this device? Yes. Was it able to increase motion during sustained sitting? So while the person was sitting, were they static or were they able to move more? And they were. They were able to move more on this seat. Did it reduce the need for high levels of activity? In other words, typically to sit in a good posture, it requires a lot of work. It requires too much work. And this reduced the level of muscle activity, so it was easier. A backrest, we know, can also do this. However, we also know that when people have back pain and they're doing something like typing, they rarely use the backrest because when they're typing, they're working in front of them. And then they intermittently lean back against the backrest, and then they go forward into this position again. However, there is a big fear amongst people that if they don't have a backrest, they may not be able to function. And then the other thing is that this allows, in the future, the opportunity to vary and increase the load. So for example, we looked at it in a relatively stable position. So not too unstable at the start, but obviously that can be varied over time. Now, while we were doing this study in Limerick and Belgium, Wim Grooten was doing a similar study in the Karolinska. They looked at 13 pain-free subjects doing similar tasks, again, typing. They looked at 6 positions, so standing, 3 different variations of this, basically making it more and more unstable, and then a saddle chair and an ordinary office chair. And they measured posture, so they measured how upright the person was, and center of pressure. Center of pressure basically means where on the floor the person's weight is going. So for example, is their center of pressure moving a lot, or are they still static? So they measured center of pressure with a force platform, just measuring how much movement. And then these are the different positions. So standing, a saddle chair, a typical office chair, and then 3 different variations of the back. What they found is what you would expect. Basically, these are the 3 variations of this chair. And the more unstable you make it, so the more you release the ball down to the red zone, the more you move. So you can basically use this to go from a small amount of movement to a lot more, depending on how you want to increase the motion. These numbers basically just show how much it moves compared to standing, a saddle chair, and an office chair. This was a typical representation in one person. They also looked at how quickly the person moved. So for example, we don't want the person to be sitting on the chair and nearly falling. We want it to be nice, slow, controlled movement. What we see is that in standing, the body moves small amounts of movement, nice and slowly. And on the back up and the 2 usual variations, the amount of movement is large, as we saw on the last slide, but the speed of movement is nice and slow. It's actually slower than the office chair and saddle chair, and we think that might have advantages. So the conclusions from the Karolinska study. The mean posture on the back up is similar to normal standing. In other words, same as what we found in Limerick, when you sit on the back up, it's very hard to slouch. It encourages you to be more like standing. On an office chair, the pelvis is backwardly rotated on an office chair compared to being on the back up. When you're sitting on this chair, there's more movement, and the movement is slower. So it's not rapid or unsafe. And the red zone, which is when you drop the ball even further and make it more unsteady, that resulted in the greatest amount of movement, which could be used potentially for training purposes, particularly for challenging the stability muscles of the trunk, the back, and the abdomen. So we're in the process of publishing these papers. Is an example of perfect timing I found out last night. One of them was accepted in Ergonomics. Another one has been submitted to manual therapy. So that's where they are at the moment. The key messages from the presentation. Posture on the back up is more similar to normal standing than slouching. Movement on the back up is slower than, for example, sitting on an office chair. So it allows you to move in a nice, slow manner. It reduces the muscular effort required to sit in a good posture. So what we mean by that is it takes away some of the effort of sitting in a good posture. And considering how many people say it's too hard to maintain good posture, this is potentially important. So if you think back to the start of today's talk, when I asked people, why wouldn't they sit upright? Because it's too hard usually. By reducing the amount of muscle activity you need, it reduces the chance of fatigue. So there's less likelihood of becoming sore and tired while sitting on this chair. Some people would feel that you could only use that as a training stool, and then you might need another chair. But again, we have to do more studies. But if you keep your levels of muscle activity low and controlled, that's not a concern. And we know that the red zone causes a lot more motion, so that could be used for training rather than sitting on it. In other words, this might make sitting well or sitting in a good posture a little bit easier. And it might be part of a toolkit for spinal health when we combine it again with some of the things we spoke about earlier in terms of physical activity and managing lifestyle factors, stress and so on. So where do we go next? We need to test this on more subjects with low back pain is the obvious one, first of all. I'll discuss that in a moment. We need to compare it to a standard office chair now with a backrest. As I said, we didn't use a backrest in that study because it would be an extra variable to consider. We need to do longer durations. We need to get people sitting for several hours to ensure that they're comfortable on both. We need to consider it as one part of a multifactorial part of back pain. So for example, we need to look at the whole office environment, the person's lifestyle. We need to find out more about the training effect of the unstable zone. So when you make it more unsteady, more challenging, what happens then? We need to consider how we can match it to an individual person. So for example, in my own clinic, I would suggest that people who say, I have a lot of pain sitting, driving, but my pain is better when I'm, in other words, less slouched, like walking, standing, jogging, it might be very suitable to give them a chair that helps them maintain a good posture. One consideration is that we need to remember that sometimes less is more. In other words, more muscle activity is not always good. If we want to maintain good posture, sometimes it's nice to have nice low levels of muscle activity. In terms of back pain subjects, we've collected some preliminary data then looking at a 1-hour typing task on the back app versus a standardized office chair, this time with the backrest, the arm rests, all the usual. And in the group of people we've selected, their low back pain has been significantly reduced. But we need to make that a much bigger study. I'd like to acknowledge some of the people, the Health Research Board of Ireland, who support me in my research, all the different universities, the people at BACAP who sponsored the research, and we have time for lots of questions. Thank you. Any questions?
What was the N? How many people were in that study?
And the one in Ireland, 12. The one in Karolinska, 13. And they were all pain-free participants. So they're people, as a preliminary study, of just looking at what happens to healthy pain-free people when you put them on a chair. The next plan is to look at a much bigger group, and a much bigger group with back pain. Ideally, those who are specifically aggravated during sitting. So for example, some people with back pain are comfortable sitting. We want to look at those specifically aggravated in sitting.
12 and 13 are quite small.
Oh, they are. And they are that's why they are preliminary studies in healthy controls. Yeah.
Were there any other observations of the participants, like you probably asked them random observations or feelings and so on the chair?
Yeah, so we asked them like lots of qualitative questions, like their comfort on it, the discomfort. We asked them overall body discomfort. The one thing we were particularly conscious of is that some saddle chairs increase buttock discomfort. So we looked at overall discomfort and then each individual region. And basically, on average, the discomfort here was about 21% less, sorry, 18% less than on the other chairs. But they didn't report it. But I would be more interested in looking at the subjects with back pain and seeing how we change that as well. And we would look at all of them. And our preliminary work so far, which needs to be much bigger, is that the buttock discomfort isn't as much of a concern. But that's something that we need to keep an eye on. Yes?
For how long did you measure each posture in the position?
Oh yeah. So the typing tasks were 10 minutes. And then the good posture, like when we positioned them into the good posture, 5 minutes.
How long they had been sitting before you measured them?
They had been sitting for about, it would have been up to about 10 minutes. They had to fill in some paperwork, their consent forms and so on. They were tested then, both tested on the same day in a random order. So for example, if you come in as a subject, a coin was cost and you may get this chair first or the next one. And you got, let me get this right, 2 minutes of a break between each one. So you sat on this chair, you stood for 2 minutes, you could walk, and you sit on the other one. And then that order is random.
Well, now that the sitting in chairs in regular, it's hours and hours, and usually the bad or good things, the chairs start coming up after 4 or 6 hours of sitting. So if you take only after a few minutes of sitting, then you definitely don't get any of the people's feelings after 4 or 6 hours of sitting.
Yeah, well, one thing is we need to look at longer duration, which is one of the pointers I was mentioning. We need to look at longer duration, but for example, in another study we're doing, we looked at the response people get to pain in 10 minutes when sitting on a chair. And basically those who get increased pain in 10 minutes, they are the people who report more pain later. So even though it's only 10 minutes, people know very quickly. You can't say 20 seconds, but within 10 minutes, people will know if they're going to be comfortable or not.
Which do you connect the discomfort to go with? The discomfort doesn't come up from someplace. So what is the reason for discomfort and comfort on the chair?
In this chair or all chairs?
In general, when we sit and we have comfort
Yeah.
Well, basically, when we sit
Yeah.
down, we are all
Why?
comfortable walking.
Yes.
When we sit down, then the discomfort starts. To build up
Yeah. No, that's
for
it.
certain things.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea where the discomfort comes from?
No, it's a great question. It looks like the first thing that becomes uncomfortable is muscle tension. So we get muscle fatigue from prolonged sitting. And that's probably because of ischemia, or a change in blood supply. So for example, if the muscles stay tense in one position, the blood supply doesn't change. But also if you assume end range postures, so if you go to the end range here, or the end range in the other direction, tissues in the back like ligaments and discs and joint capsules are stretched, and then they don't get their blood supply. So there's a number of factors, but the primary one is usually muscle tension.
So all the things lead into the basic metabolism after also the blood circulation.
Usually, we'll say in terms of people who develop discomfort during sitting, you can actually compare. They've done it particularly in neck and shoulders, where they do most of this research. They can do blood samples and look at changes in lactate and increases in discomfort. But it's very much related to low levels of discomfort building up.
How many of your users prefer to use this chair rather than the normal?
I better get that number right. I think I don't have the exact numbers. Basically, we asked them which they preferred. The majority preferred this. I'm not certain. Was it 9-3? But I'm not certain. I can check that out.
If they choose this one, so are they going to choose this chair as a permanent chair? I mean, that they want to use in holiday, or no, just for a spare chair that when they get tired, they can use of this chair?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We just asked them which do they prefer to sit on for the period of the test. We want to follow that up in longer term to see, can they sit on these chairs, for example, all day? Because the few who didn't felt, oh, it was lovely, but what about a backrest? I might get tired. And we have to follow that up over a longer period of time. Like I said, there is a fear out there amongst people that, I mightn't be able to support my body. Yet we do it walking, and we do it standing, and we do it doing everything else. But we assume if we sit, it should be, completely passive. But very good question.
My biggest concern about the pelvic health when we are sitting on the chairs is we have three major vessels. We have a femoral, which is in front, and there this extended posture is keeping good circulation in the femoral. Then we have poplite at the back of the thigh, back of and that, for my understanding, does not stay in good condition. So the back circulation here stops with this design. And the third major is pudendal circulation under the pelvic floor. There is this pump, which, according to my vision, also stops the circulation quite efficiently.
Right. Well, I suppose the bottom line is nobody knows because nobody's done any studies. So, for example, there would be people who would say, if you change anything, it's dangerous. And other people who say if you change something, it's brilliant. And what I would say is, I don't know until we check these things out. Pudendal discomfort and pelvic discomfort is a concern, and that's why we specifically asked about, same as in any saddle design chair, is there any problem with pelvic discomfort? And again, a lot of people get pudendal or pelvic discomfort is that they sit here, and I wouldn't like to sit like that. So that's one part of it. In terms of blood supply, I think if there were any concerns, we should check those things. Yeah. Freddie was the only one that waved his hands. So.
But backup is something I invented because somebody said to me, Freddie, you can sit at the balance board. How we should do it? Which other for people? I didn't know. First time when I made a very, very simple book talk, I felt that's what I want people to share. I want people to sit, and I feel it's a really big project. It has been more and more accurate for people to sit actively than we try to do. Maybe there is some more things to do, more improvements, better solutions, but the idea of sitting at the chair and move, but we will go on. We will plan more projects. We shall study more. We shall learn more, because it's only the truth and realities that means something. And I hope, what I hope is that our surroundings, the standard chairs, that we are not having too much opposition, too much problems with coming up with such new ideas. Because we need, as the development goes on, more and more passive, and young ones also, we need to see the carers. And we will continue to work with Kieran. Very nice. Thank you very much, Kieran, for your presentation.
No worries.
And very nice of you to come. Appreciate that very much. And thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much. I will be staying here, and I can speak even slower on my own. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to tell you more about what we have planned, or if you have any other questions. Thank you for your time. Have a nice day.